the vehicle, and then also heard what had happened.
It's a very quiet neighborhood. We get very few calls, so it's very surprising to all of us.
That was just the beginning of a shocking chain of events. Behind that quiet car was a story with many layers about youth, about unfulfilled dreams, and about unexpected secrets. Brila Stone, 17 years old, is a black transgender girl living her youth with many unfulfilled dreams. Lively, intelligent, and full of courage, she often shares her image on social networks with a confident smile. But at the same time, in another world, the name Trevone Miller, 20 years old, appears with mystery and distance. Few people know that between these two people there is a silent connection, bringing with it emotions, choices, and unpredictable consequences. Arkansas, summer 2020, a quiet state where serious cases are rarely mentioned. But on that day, the atmosphere was torn apart by an abnormality that no one wanted to name. People around the area were in an uproar. Social networks passed around photos of a car on the side of the road, and the name Brila began to be associated with an unsolved mystery. What did she do there? Why that day? And what really happened inside that car? On June 24, 2020, just a day before things went strangely quiet, Brila Stone was still on social media with familiar statuses. Nothing in her words suggested uncertainty or anxiety. She was still talking about the things she loved, still smiling, still sharing pictures of herself, confident that tomorrow would continue as usual. Later that afternoon, Brila texted a close friend that she had to go somewhere, but didn't specify what it was. She didn't share her destination, nor did she mention who she was meeting. The message was sent at 5:12 p.m., after which Brila's phone continued to work, but there was little noticeable network activity. From later data, it was determined that at approximately 6:30 p.m., Brila was at a meeting point in the Sherwood area, less than a 20-minute drive from Little Rock. It was a dirt road near a sparsely populated area, quiet, low traffic, and virtually devoid of security cameras. Through cell phone tracking and location data, it was known that she stopped there and did not leave again after 7 p.m. What happened between 7 p.m. and the early morning hours of June 25 was a series of blanks that were never completely filled. At the same time, Trevone Miller was also determined to have left his North Little Rock residence at approximately 6:20 p.m. Cell phone and GPS data showed that his phone traveled in the direction of Sherwood and stopped in the area near where Brila was at approximately 6:55 p.m. No one in the area reported any unusual noises that night. Neighbors along the trail claimed they had not seen anything unusual, only that it was a hot evening, with few people out and about. The quietness of the area had allowed for something to happen quietly, unnoticed. Notably, at around 8:14 p.m., an anonymous social media post was discovered, with the content later drawing the attention of the online community. The poster claimed to know of unusual behavior coming soon and mentioned a name associated with Brila. However, no one had yet put the pieces of information together. There was no message from Brila after 7 p.m. No one heard her call, no one saw her leave the car. It was an area of absolute silence, and in that silence, any trace of her seemed to have been temporarily lost to time. The night passed without any alarm. By the early morning of June 25, Brila's car was still in the same spot, in the rising light of the early morning sun. No one knew that the silence of that early morning was the result of a silent but irreversible chain of events. The incident was never discovered, but the final steps of both Brila and Trevone were clearly etched on the GPS map. Early in the morning of June 25, 2020, the Arkansas sky was a pale blue, as quiet as usual. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves, shining on the deserted road. No one expected that this very silence was covering something no one wanted to believe was real. At around 6:45 a.m., a resident living near the Brookswood Trail in Sherwood went out for a walk as usual. This is a suburban road with little traffic, usually frequented only by locals. This location is about a 15-minute drive from downtown Little Rock, surrounded by trees and low grass, creating a feeling of separation from the urban space. When passing a small turn, this person came across a silver car parked on the side of the road, an image that was not unusual, but something made him stop. The car had been sitting there since yesterday, but now it looked as if no one had ever left. The passenger side window was open a crack and sunlight was streaming in. There was no movement, no sound, just silence. At first, the man moved closer to get a better look, but after a few seconds, a sense of unease made him stop, take out his phone and call 911. The call came in at 6:53 a.m. The caller described a car that had been sitting for too long and something was wrong inside, though he wasn't sure what. Less than 10 minutes later, a Sherwood police patrol car arrived on the scene. They approached cautiously, taking note of the exterior of the car, and quickly cordoned off the area to preserve any evidence they might have. When the police looked inside through the glass, they noticed a still image that had not changed since the night before. The interior of the car appeared intact, with no signs of displacement. A few personal items were on the passenger seat, and a duffel bag was neatly placed in the back seat. More importantly, it was the position of the occupants, unmoving and unresponsive, that immediately triggered the emergency response. The police called in backup and paramedics. Within 30 minutes of the initial call, the area was cordoned off, and an initial inspection was conducted. Although nothing could be concluded at that point, everyone present sensed that this was no ordinary situation. Every glance exchanged between the responding officers was tinged with caution. Every detail, from where the car was parked to the condition of the contents inside, was recorded line by line. The car's ownership information was verified through the license plate, and the name Brila Stone appeared for the first time in the police records that morning. However, at 7:40 a.m., no one at the scene knew the true identity of the person inside. She was only 17 years old, and until then, everything was just a pile of suspicions. This discovery, which began from a seemingly normal walking habit, became the starting point for a long series of investigations, shaking the local community and the whole country. And from that moment, an investigation began quietly but urgently, with each small detail gradually revealing connections that no one had noticed before. The discovery of the car on the morning of June 25, 2020, not only opened up an unusual crime scene, but also laid the first bricks for a long, quiet, but urgent investigation. Within hours, the identity of the girl in the car was determined to be Brila Stone, 17 years old, a teenager living in Arkansas, known in the community as a brave young person, true to herself. After confirming her personal information through the license plate and medical records, the police began to review her most recent activities in the previous 48 hours. The first thing they did was retrieve phone data, location history, text messages, calls, and social networks. Location records showed that Brila left her home at around 6:30 p.m. on June 24, traveling to Sherwood, a quiet residential area northeast of Little Rock. The phone signal stopped at the same location as where the car was discovered. The single text message sent that afternoon, while not immediately noticeable, would later prove to be a crucial clue in tracking down the last person she had seen. As they searched through the list of people who had interacted closely with her, one name stood out: Trevone Hayes Miller, 20, of North Little Rock. According to phone records, Trevone's device was recorded traveling to the Sherwood area that evening, stopping around the time that Brila was last seen. Their connection was not made public, but text messages showed that the two had been chatting for weeks, with increasing frequency. Some of the messages were guarded, especially from Trevone, suggesting he was worried about their relationship being discovered. The vague, cryptic messages made it impossible for investigators to ignore their suspicions. On July 6, 2020, Trevone was called in to meet with investigators as the last point of contact. The initial meeting was casual, and he appeared calm, but a series of questions about his location, time, and connection to Brila began to make his confusion clear. Trevone claimed that he had been home that night and had not gone anywhere, but GPS data and network logs from his phone suggested otherwise. When asked why his signal matched where the car was found, Trevone was inconsistent in his explanation. These clues led the police to officially name him as a suspect and obtain a search warrant for his personal devices. Meanwhile, Brila's friends began to share what they had heard from her. A close friend said that Brila had said that someone was very afraid of others knowing about their connection, and that she felt unsafe if she continued texting. Though no names were mentioned, when comparing the content of the conversations, the emotions, and the timing, all eyes began to turn to Trevone. When the search warrant was approved, investigators discovered a series of recently deleted messages on Trevone's storage device, but recovered via the cloud sync system. These conversations showed that he and Brila had planned to meet on the evening of June 24. In them, Trevone expressed anxiety, fearing that things would get out of hand if others knew he had a relationship with a transgender person. This detail led investigators to see the incident as not just intentional, but also complex psychological. On July 8, 2020, police executed an arrest warrant for Trevone Hayes Miller. He was charged with a felony and booked into the Pulaski County Detention Center. At the same time, the investigation was expanded to include additional witness testimony and digital evidence. One of the details considered a turning point came from the account of the manager at Trevone's workplace, a local fast food chain. According to the manager, Trevone called the day after the incident and said only one sentence: "I messed up, I may never come back." The meaning of those words at the time was not fully understood, but in the context of the case, it became a point of establishing the suspect's psychological state. At the same time, a social media post that appeared on the evening of June 24 was also included in the investigation. The anonymous post mentioned a payment for a supposed pay to do something involving a trans person in the Little Rock area. Although no name was mentioned, the details of the post were eerily similar to Brila's information and the time of her disappearance. Police later determined there was insufficient evidence to directly link the post to Trevone, but it was kept on file because of its suspicious nature. Over several days of cross-referencing data, statements, and behavior, investigators were able to reconstruct a fairly complete timeline, from Brila leaving the house to meeting Trevone to the time the phone stopped working. During the interview, Trevone never admitted to anything specific, but the more he remained silent, the more evidence emerged, like conversations, GPS signals, and denials that contradicted objective data. The investigative file grew every day, and the community began to follow the case with special attention, not only because of its seriousness, but also because it is one of the rare cases where the death of a young transgender person is investigated with such vigor and transparency. With all the pieces of the puzzle almost in place, the final question still hangs. What really happened in those hours of the night, between two people who shared conversations that were fraught with conflicting intimacy and avoidance? The answer will only come in court, where everything will be told, clearly, in the light of justice. The trial began in mid-August 2021 in a Pulaski County courtroom where windows cast light over rows of wooden benches, quiet and focused. On August 13, 2021, Trevone Hayes Miller, then 20, entered the courtroom as a defendant who had entered a plea bargain. The judge, Barry Sims, was in charge of sentencing. As the hearing began, the state's attorney offered a deal. Trevone would plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a reduced capital murder charge, with a penalty of death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although no detailed testimony from the defendant was made public, court documents presented a series of compelling evidence about the time, location, and motive of the crime. The prosecution argued that this action was to prevent Brila Stone from revealing a secret relationship involving the defendant's sexuality and personal honor. After the prosecution's argument, the defense attorneys then made their case. They mentioned Trevone's young age, the psychological factors and social pressures, and the desire to keep face in the eyes of others. They asked for special circumstances to mitigate the sentence. However, the judge did not stop there. He pointed out the seriousness of the loss of a young person, the widespread grief in the community, and the great influence of punishment to maintain deterrence. After some deliberation, the court sentenced him to a total of 50 years in prison, 40 years for first-degree murder, plus 10 years aggravated for using a weapon. The ruling means Trevone will be eligible for parole after serving at least 35 years, a long sentence that reflects the harshness of the legal system's approach to the case. The sentence not only brings closure to a heartbreaking case, but also sends a clear message. Actions that erase differences or hide one's identity will not be tolerated. In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, the LGBTQ+ community in Arkansas and across the country reacted strongly. Organizations like the Human Rights Campaign spoke out, stressing that this country failed Brila and that the fight must continue to protect the most vulnerable. In Little Rock, many people wearing red and purple scarves, symbolizing courage and remembrance, gathered in silence to honor the young woman's death. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForBrila spread like wildfire, expressing outrage at the loss, as well as an urgent call for education, anti-gender discrimination, and identity understanding. Posts sharing images of her smiling face before her pain faded moved viewers and made them wonder about a more just society. The end of the trial was a wake-up call. The law had spoken, justice had been established, and society could no longer turn its back on stories like Brila's. Viewers, listeners, and those who listened carried a sense of sadness, one that was hard to forget. No one can predict the last time a person will see, text, or be called by their real name. For Brila Stone, those moments came much sooner than anyone who knew her imagined. A 17-year-old girl, living authentically, living beautifully, and bravely walking a path that not everyone has the confidence to choose. The loss lies not only in the silence of an empty chair, but also in the future that has not yet blossomed, in the things Brila could have become but will never have the chance. The family lost a child, friends lost an inspiration, and society perhaps lost a rare piece of courage in a world full of prejudice. The case is over, the verdict is announced, but the lingering questions remain. How do we protect a young person who dares to live authentically? How can death not become a prerequisite for us to start caring? Brila's story is not just a criminal case, but also a direct snapshot of today's society, where people are still vulnerable because of their identity. It raises urgent questions about gender education, about kindness and how we view others, and about listening before judging. If a community cannot keep its most vulnerable safe, are we really a community? So, in the end, will we remember Brila as a victim or as a reminder? And will her name one day become a symbol of change? Not because of what she lost, but because of what we learned from that loss.
Told you about Taya Ashton back in 2021 when this all happened.
We took into consideration the fact that Taya had rights to be here.
Was when he first learned that Taya was not born a female.
Suitland, Maryland, a small town just outside Washington, D.C., where high-rise apartment buildings line the streets, life seems as peaceful as any other American suburb. During the day, young families stroll along the lawns, old people sit on their porches, and young people gather in cafes near the subway station. But when night falls, the atmosphere is different, quiet, sometimes cold, as if hiding something untold. In the middle of the town is a multi-story apartment building where a young woman is starting her own life. Taya Ashton, just 20 years old, is beautiful, ambitious, and always smiling at those around her. To her friends, she radiates positive energy. To her family, she is the pride. But behind it all, Taya is still walking on a challenging path, a journey to find acceptance and to be true to herself. Not far away, a 27-year-old man named Alan Price also appeared in the picture. He was not prominent, not attracting attention, but he was attached to Taya in a way that few people knew. There was a connection between them that was hard to name, both close and distant, as if there was something that did not want to be revealed. And it was this ambiguity that created a thick layer of fog, obscuring the truth that no one expected. On the night of July 17, 2021, Suitland was as quiet as ever. But in one apartment in the complex, neighbors suddenly noticed some unusual sounds, tense conversations, hurried footsteps. Then, the space fell silent. No one in the building could have predicted that, just a few hours later, the entire community would be shocked by a heartbreaking truth. What happened behind the door of that apartment? How did a place that was supposed to be safe become the scene of a tragedy? And what is the relationship between Taya Ashton and Alan Price really hiding? These questions still hang in the air, leading us into a story that is both tragic and haunting. The morning of July 17, 2021, passed by normally for most people in the apartment complex in the town of Suitland. But for Taya Ashton, it was a special day. She chatted with friends via text, shared new photos, and talked about unfinished plans. No one would have guessed that those cheerful messages were the last remaining traces of a young girl gradually entering adulthood. In the afternoon, Taya returned to her apartment. Neighbors saw her in the hallway, looking hurried but still having time to smile and greet acquaintances. In the small apartment, the light from the window showed that she was still busy with her own work. The air of a hot summer day made many people in the building just want to close the doors and find some peace for themselves. However, that peace was quickly disturbed by unexpected events. Early in the evening, a visitor appeared at the apartment complex. He was no stranger to Taya. It was Alan Price, a 27-year-old man with whom she had a romantic relationship. The relationship was not widely known, partly because they kept it a secret, and partly because there were many complexities that were difficult to explain. For Taya, it could have been a mixture of trust and fragility. For Price, it was a conflicted struggle. They met in Taya's apartment. No one was sure what was said in that room, but neighbors reported hearing low, sometimes tense conversations through the thin walls. It wasn't the first time such sounds had occurred, but that night seemed longer and heavier than usual. A few minutes later, the noises stopped, leaving an unnatural silence. People upstairs said they heard quick footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was leaving in a hurry. Then everything fell silent. To the neighbors, it was just a passing detail in everyday life. They had no idea that the silence hid a serious truth. Looking back, there were probably warning signs. Taya had told a few friends that she was feeling uneasy about the tension in her relationship. However, she tried to keep it to herself, hoping that things would work out soon. Her friends thought it was just a normal teenage romance, but no one expected that her insecurity would become part of a tragic story later on. As for Alan Price, those who knew him described him as a rather reserved person. In their eyes, Price was not someone who easily expressed his emotions, but sometimes behaved erratically and unpredictably. It was this inner conflict that made anyone who had been in contact with him for a long time feel that something was wrong, even if they could not name it. That night in Taya Ashton's small apartment, the two young people faced each other, with mixed emotions, things that had never been said clearly and hidden secrets. No one directly witnessed everything that happened behind that door, but the scattered sounds, hurried footsteps, and heavy silence left a big question mark for all those who later learned about the incident. And then, when the night passed, the story seemed to end in silence, but that was only the beginning of a series of events that shocked the whole community. In an apartment complex accustomed to quiet nights, sometimes the slightest sound was enough to draw the neighbors' attention. That evening, the person living next door noticed that the light in Taya's room was on for an unusually long time. By midnight, the light was still on, causing anxiety. The first person to sense that something was wrong was a neighbor who lived right next door. He noticed that the light in Taya's room was left on for an unusually long time. Around midnight, when the light still remained on and no further activity was heard, his concern became evident. The neighbor initially intended to knock on the door to ask, but hesitated, not wanting to intrude on the privacy of the apartment. Instead, he decided to call the building manager to check. When the manager arrived, they tried to reach out but got no response. The unease quickly turned into a decision. They would call emergency services. Minutes later, a 911 call came in reporting an emergency at Taya Ashton's apartment. The caller's voice was anxious, her words incomplete, but it was enough for the dispatchers to understand that police and paramedics needed to be dispatched immediately. At the dispatch center, the call was immediately logged and routed to the nearest units. Within minutes, the red and blue lights of patrol cars lit up the small streets of Suitland. Sirens echoed through the night, waking up residents who had been sleeping. Some peeked out their windows, wondering what was happening in their normally quiet neighborhood. As the officers entered the hallway, the atmosphere was tense. Every footstep seemed to echo louder than usual. The police quickly approached Taya's apartment, working with paramedics to check on the situation. The usual procedure was followed, calling loudly at the door, trying one last time to contact them, then using a spare key from the manager to get inside. As soon as they entered, the medical staff understood at a glance that the situation was beyond saving. A brief confirmation rang out, causing a heavy atmosphere to fill the hallway. The news quickly spread through the hallway. Curious residents glanced over, some covering their mouths, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. They were not allowed to get close, but the eyes of the police officers and medical staff said it all. A heartbreaking truth had appeared right in that small apartment. That night, the scene was immediately cordoned off. Yellow tape stretched from the hallway to the entrance, separating the familiar living area of the residents from the space that had now become the focus of a major investigation. Police began taking statements from those living nearby, paying attention to every little detail. Unusual noises, when lights were turned on, or hurried footsteps in the hallway. The first clues were slowly being pieced together, but for the community, all was wrapped up in a single shock. The young girl they used to greet every day now left them in a situation no one could have imagined. And that was just the beginning of a series of big questions waiting to be answered. When Taya Ashton's apartment was sealed off, the entire complex was strangely silent. Yellow tape ran across the hallways, making it seem like a separate world, where all eyes were on it but no one was allowed to enter. Inside, every detail was noted because, for investigators, each item could be an important piece in reconstructing what happened. The living room lights were still on. The small chair was placed a little out of place. A few personal items were lying untouched on the table, as if Taya had not long ago let them go. On the shelf, the pictures of her and her friends were still neatly arranged, suggesting a youthful, hopeful life. But in contrast to that scene, the air was thick with silence, a silence that did not belong in a place that was once filled with laughter. Forensic workers begin their work with meticulous care. They note every detail, the lighting in the room, the air temperature, even the placement of small objects. Every element can help determine the time frame in which the incident occurred. A clock in the bedroom stopped at a specific time, providing a crucial time frame to compare with neighbors' accounts and security camera footage. After completing the scene recording, a medical examination was conducted. The official conclusion was that Taya had died in her apartment on the evening of July 17. The estimated time of death coincided with the time when neighbors heard strange noises in the hallway. The cause of death was clearly established, reinforcing the hypothesis that this was not a natural death, but the result of a deliberate act. In addition, the experts also noted a few unusual details. The door showed no signs of being broken into, indicating that the person who entered was not a stranger. Some small traces in the room revealed that Taya had been staying with an acquaintance, and this quickly directed the next step of the investigation. When the investigation was finished, the apartment was no longer simply the residence of a young girl, but the center of a big question. Who was the last person to be there, and what really happened that fateful summer night. The night of July 17 ended in shock, but that was only the beginning of a complex investigation. With the scene sealed off and the preliminary report completed, the criminal police team entered the crucial phase, searching for the truth behind Taya Ashton's death. Based on forensic details showing that the door had not been forced open, the police believed that the last person inside the apartment must have been a familiar face. Thanks to that, they quickly narrowed down the list of individuals close to Taya: friends, colleagues, relatives, and especially those who had had a romantic relationship with her. As the neighbors' accounts were compiled, a clearer picture emerged. Several confirmed hearing a strange male voice coming from the apartment that evening. One recalled seeing a man hurrying down the hallway. Security camera footage was also pulled up. The images were blurry, but enough to confirm that Taya was not alone in her final hours. Alan Price stood out on the list of people to approach. He was Taya's on and off boyfriend, a relationship that was kept private but not entirely secret. Some of Taya's friends had heard her talk about how the relationship had been strained at times. As a result, Price quickly became the center of attention. When contacted by the police, Price was cooperative, but there were some strange points. Initially, he claimed that he had not seen Taya that day. However, the apartment building's camera data recorded an image of a person with the same build and clothing as him, appearing right around the time that neighbors heard the unusual noise. This inconsistency immediately called Price's testimony into question. The initial interrogation was tense. The investigators peppered him with questions. Where were you on the evening of July 17? Can anyone confirm? What is your relationship with Taya now? Price initially tried to appear calm, but the fragments of his testimony kept contradicting each other. One moment he said he was at home, another he mentioned meeting friends. When the police asked for corroborating evidence, Price fumbled and could not give a convincing answer. Meanwhile, the investigation team continued to expand the collection of evidence. Taya's phone was analyzed, revealing many text messages exchanged with Price in the previous days. The content showed that the two had tense conversations, sometimes ending in long silences. In particular, on July 17, there was a series of text messages between the two recorded, but Price did not mention this detail in his testimony. This was the crucial turning point. The words and the technical data did not match. Investigators began to build the theory that Price was present at the scene, and that a conflicted romantic relationship was the key to understanding the motive. During subsequent questioning, Price appeared to waver. When asked why neighbors had heard him in Taya's apartment, Price responded with evasiveness. At times, he denied it outright. At other times, he admitted to stopping by, but only chatted a little. Each change in his story only strengthened the police's belief that they were on the right track. To build their case, investigators sought out people who knew Price. Many witnesses said he had exhibited a troubled mental state, often worried about being judged by others. Some recalled him mentioning Taya in private conversations as a complex, attached yet conflicted person. These accounts painted a portrait that was far from the calm exterior Price tried to project. The key piece of evidence came when Price's phone's location data was examined. The signal showed that his device had traveled to the exact area of Taya's apartment during the time frame of the incident. This was an undeniable detail because it completely contradicted his previous assertion that he did not see Taya that day. When all the pieces of the puzzle were put together, the police decided to make an arrest. At that point, Price could no longer keep his composure as before. Being confronted with a series of clear evidence forced him to keep quiet, no longer resisting. The investigation then moved into the stage of consolidating the case file, preparing for the prosecution process. The case file was filled with all the elements: inconsistent testimony, technical data, neighbor testimony, and especially phone location evidence. All of them reconstructed a logical scenario, showing that Price was the last person inside the apartment with Taya Ashton. But perhaps what bothered many people the most was the motive behind it. Throughout the investigation, the image of a man struggling with internal conflicts gradually emerged. It was not just an ordinary case, but also a testament to how social prejudices and never-confessed personal secrets can push a person into tragedy. When the case was filed in court, the police and prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to charge him. But for the community, the big question still echoed. How could a relationship that once stemmed from attachment lead to such a cruel ending? After months of preparation, Taya Ashton's case was brought before the Prince George's County Courthouse. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with people: Taya's family and friends, community representatives, and reporters. Everyone was weighed down because this was not just a typical criminal case, but also a reminder of the fragility of lives seeking the right to be true to themselves. As the trial opened, prosecutors systematically laid out their evidence. They described key timelines, text messages between Taya and Alan Price, cell phone location data, neighbors' accounts, and details from the crime scene. They said that when all of these elements were put together, they painted a clear picture. Price was the last person seen with Taya. The defense sought to minimize his client's responsibility, emphasizing Price's mental state, the pressures he faced, and his immaturity in handling the situation. They sought to portray him as someone caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, rather than someone who intentionally caused the tragedy. On the stand, Price finally admitted his presence in the apartment. However, when questioned further about the reasons and specific events, his answers were repeatedly off-topic and inconsistent. That made the jury pay even more attention to the objective evidence presented by the prosecution. Throughout the proceedings, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense but solemn. Taya's family sat silently, their eyes following every word, every piece of evidence presented. For them, this was a moment of direct confrontation with the man who had changed their daughter's life forever. Some of Taya's friends wept as they heard the final details about her, while community activists clasped hands, calling this a test of justice and fairness. After days of debate, the jury reached its final decision. Price was sentenced to 60 years in prison, 48 of which must be served immediately, with the remainder suspended and subject to reduction if strict conditions are met. The sentence was considered severe, reflecting the court's commitment to handling cases involving prejudice and disrespect for human dignity. As the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Then sobs erupted from the victims' families. For them, it was not reparation for their loss, but at least a recognition that justice had been served. Taya's friends said they hoped the verdict would serve as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to let prejudice and bias rule their actions. Outside the court, the media quickly reported the news. Many human rights organizations hailed it as a step forward, demonstrating the seriousness of the legal system in handling cases involving transgender people. Editorials stressed that the sentence was not only for the perpetrator, but also symbolic, sending the message that every individual's life is equally valuable. In the community, the reaction was both sad and hopeful. Sad because of the great loss of a young girl, but also hopeful because finally, justice had spoken. As the courtroom doors closed, the verdict could not ease the void that Taya Ashton's family and friends will carry with them for the rest of their lives. An ambitious young woman has passed away, leaving a void in the hearts of her loved ones and in the memories of the community. This tragedy reminds us that understanding and humanity must come before prejudice, because only when each individual lives safely and with respect can society truly be just. At the same time, this story also reminds us to be vigilant. Silent conflicts, without dialogue and respect, can explode into unpredictable consequences. Justice lies not only in court decisions, but also in the community's responsibility to create a safe and humane environment for all. Taya Ashton has become a symbol of a warning that silence in the face of prejudice can be too costly. But at the same time, her death has left a legacy urging society to move closer to equality. And the question that lingers is, are we really doing enough to protect those around us from similar tragedies?
She was a very outgoing person. Cashay was fabulous. She had a big heart. She loved children. She liked to have fun. She was always happy. And her life ended so soon. I just hope everybody get justice.
Around 9 a.m. on February 26, 2023, the city of Milwaukee was still immersed in the cold of late winter when a 911 call broke the silence. The dispatcher panicked. Smoke coming from the apartment on the second floor. The fire is spreading very quickly. Minutes later, the fire alarm and the flashing lights of fire trucks woke up the quiet neighborhood in fear. Security cameras around the neighborhood recorded thick black smoke billowing up and red flames shining through windows, an unusual scene no one expected to see on a Sunday morning. Inside the apartment was Cashay Henderson, 31, a transgender woman known to her friends and neighbors for her bright smile and her way of living life to the fullest. To the local LGBTQ+ community, she was not only a familiar face, but also a source of positive energy, always warming the atmosphere. But that morning, instead of the familiar laughter, Cashay's living space was engulfed in smoke and panic. People stood along the sidewalk, watching the firefighters try to control the raging fire. The sound of metal cracking and the smell of burning smoke filled the small street. A sense of unease crept into every gaze. Something more terrible than the fire was lurking in the ashes. Those who knew Cashay all had the same question. What really happened behind that closed door, just before the fire engulfed the entire apartment? The atmosphere of that winter morning will forever be a chilling memory for those who witnessed it, because they could not have imagined that tragedy had crept into their own neighborhood. And the unanswered question still lingers. What led to the fire and the tragic fate of Cashay Henderson? On the evening of February 25, 2023, Milwaukee was in the dead of winter. The streets were deserted, with only the yellow lights shining through the thin layer of snow that remained. In the silence, neighbors in the Northwest neighborhood saw a familiar sight. 31-year-old Cashay Henderson returning to her small second-floor apartment. To them, the sight was completely normal, as Cashay often came home late from meetings with friends. No one expected that it would be the last time they saw her alive. Not long after she entered the house, several nearby residents recalled hearing strange noises. The noises were intermittent, not lasting long, and quickly fell silent. Thinking they were just ordinary quarrels or collisions, no one paid much attention. These fleeting details were gradually forgotten until the incident occurred. Near dawn on February 26, a witness happened to see the silhouette of a man leaving the building. In the dim light of the street lamps, the face could not be clearly recognized, but the hurried, somewhat furtive gait left the image etched in his memory. At first, the witness did not think it was anything important, but just a few minutes later, everything changed. Thin wisps of smoke began to escape from the second-floor windows. At first, they were just wisps of smoke, but they quickly thickened and billowed upward. Soon, flames erupted from inside the house, flaring up fiercely. Cashay's apartment was bathed in a red glow that reflected down the alley, waking up the entire neighborhood. The fire spread with incredible speed, casting flickering lights across the walls. Residents of the building and nearby apartments ran out in panic. Some called 911 and screamed to wake their neighbors. The fire alarm rang out repeatedly, the sound of footsteps running on the cold snow mixed with shouts, creating an atmosphere of unprecedented chaos in this normally quiet neighborhood. Standing from the yard, many people helplessly looked up to the second floor, where the fire was growing bigger and bigger. In just a moment, the small apartment where they used to see Cashay smiling and waving was covered in black smoke and red flames. A feeling of fear mixed with shock crept into every gaze, because everything happened so fast, no one had time to react. The distant sound of fire sirens carried a faint hope, but for the onlookers, the minutes dragged on. They saw the reflection of the fire on each other's faces, the nervous gripping of hands, and the gasps of breath in the cold. A heavy atmosphere hung over the neighborhood. As dawn broke, the fire was still raging. Black smoke billowed high into the sky, and a strong, acrid smell permeated the small alley. Many residents stood still, their eyes glued to the disfigured second-floor apartment. They did not know what had happened inside, but the loss was clear to all. The peaceful night was torn apart by smoke and fire. And with that, a chilling question began to form. What really happened behind the closed doors of the Cashay Henderson apartment just before the fire broke out? Around 9 a.m. on February 26, 2023, fire trucks rushed into a quiet neighborhood in northwest Milwaukee. The second floor of a residential building was still smoking, its shattered windows revealing thick plumes of black smoke billowing out. Nearby residents, many still reeling from a sleepless night, gathered outside, their eyes glued to the chaotic scene before them. Firefighters immediately deployed hoses to extinguish the smoldering embers in the apartment. Once the fire was under control, they went inside to search. Amid the charred ruins, firefighters were surprised to find a body. Shortly after, the identity was confirmed. It was Cashay Henderson, 31, a woman who lived in the apartment. The discovery changed the situation immediately. What had initially been considered an accidental fire had turned into a particularly serious incident. Firefighters reported the incident to the center, and within minutes, police arrived and set up a security cordon around the building. The scene was completely sealed off, with no one allowed in or out except investigators. The first officers to enter the apartment recorded an unforgettable scene. All the furniture was destroyed, the walls were covered in soot, and the air still smelled of combustibles. These initial observations were quickly incorporated into the report, indicating that this was more than just an accidental fire. The case was then upgraded to a criminal case and transferred to specialized investigators. News of the discovery spread quickly throughout the city. Within hours, Cashay's friends and family were in the neighborhood. They stood behind police lines, their faces in shock as they watched their familiar apartment reduced to charred ruins. For Milwaukee's LGBTQ+ community, the news was a huge shock. Cashay was known as a sociable, cheerful woman who often brought positivity to those around her. Therefore, her passing in tragic circumstances left everyone heartbroken. The neighborhood was tense throughout the day. Many said they were still haunted by the sight of the red light that had been blazed through their windows just hours earlier. A few makeshift bouquets of flowers were left on the sidewalk, right next to the blockade, as a way to remember their neighbor, whom they saw every day. By late afternoon, the Milwaukee Police Department issued an official statement. The body found in the apartment was that of Cashay Henderson, and the case was being treated as a fatal arson. The announcement not only confirmed the firefighters' initial concerns, but also made the community aware that the morning's tragedy was more than a simple fire. On the afternoon of February 26, 2023, after the raging fire had been extinguished, the forensic team and Milwaukee investigators conducted a crime scene investigation at Cashay Henderson's apartment. The interior was almost completely burned out. The walls were stained black, the ceiling had partially collapsed, and the furniture was reduced to charred remains. The acrid smell of smoke still permeated the air, but amid the chaos, experts began to notice abnormalities. Cashay's body was quickly sent for an autopsy. The results, released later that day, shocked many. She had not died from fire or smoke inhalation, as initially believed. Her injuries indicated that she had died before the fire broke out. The time of death was determined to be between midnight on February 25 and early morning on February 26, just hours before neighbors noticed black smoke billowing from the apartment windows. This investigation immediately changed the nature of the incident. The fire was considered an accident and was upgraded to a murder case. Authorities sealed off the entire building and collected every piece of burnt wood, trace of smoke, and trace of liquid suspected to be a flammable substance. These details suggested that the fire was likely set intentionally rather than randomly. Investigators also paid close attention to the area outside. The snow had clearly marked footprints leading away from the building in the early hours of the morning. In addition, Cashay's car, which was parked nearby, was also sealed for further examination. Every detail was carefully recorded, becoming an important piece in reconstructing what happened. As the autopsy results came in, the picture became clearer. Cashay Henderson had been dead before the fire started, and the fire was a cover-up to hide the truth. This finding not only strengthened the investigation, but also raised the big question for the entire city. Who took her away, and why did they choose to set the fire to cover up all traces? Shortly after the forensic report and crime scene results were released on February 26, 2023, the Milwaukee Police Department officially classified the case as a homicide. The investigation quickly focused on one prominent name, Cordell M. Howes, 33, a man with a criminal record. Clues leading to Cordell came not only from the system's records, but also from traces left in Cashay's car and images captured by security cameras. On March 1, 2023, police and federal agents found Cordell hiding in a suburban town dozens of miles from Milwaukee. The arrest was conducted secretly and neatly to avoid attracting attention. That same night, Cordell was escorted back to Milwaukee to assist in the investigation. In the interrogation room, Cordell initially appeared calm and denied all the accusations. He said that on the night of February 25, he had not been near Cashay's apartment and had been elsewhere. However, when pressed for details, his answers changed several times, contradicting his previous statements. At times, Cordell claimed to have been with friends, and at other times he said he had gone out alone. This inconsistency raised suspicions that he was trying to hide the truth. The investigators were not quick to jump to conclusions. They laid out the objective evidence on the table: footprints in the snow leading from the house to the main road, camera footage of a figure leaving at the same time, strange fingerprints in the victim's car that were compared and confirmed to belong to Cordell. Each piece of the puzzle strung together into a clear timeline, negating all the circumlocutions. During the search, Cordell's personal cell phone became a decisive factor. When examined, investigators discovered a video he had taken inside the apartment. The recording showed Cashay's body before the fire broke out, reinforcing the forensic results and confirming that the fire was started last. This was overwhelming evidence, invalidating any denials. Additionally, a witness claimed to have seen a man leaving the building in the early morning. When comparing the identification and time frame, this testimony completely matched the remaining evidence, from cameras to traces at the scene. Throughout March 2023, the police and the prosecutor's office worked closely to consolidate their case. Every detail was put together in order: autopsy results, crime scene reports, fingerprint analysis, CCTV footage, witness statements, and phone records. All of it formed a complete dossier, clearly showing that Cashay had been murdered before the apartment burned down, and that the arson was simply a way to destroy the evidence. The prosecutor stressed that this was not a case based on speculation, but was built on forensic science, surveillance technology, and witness testimony. In addition, Cordell's escape after the incident was also noted as an act of showing a sense of avoiding responsibility. By the end of March 2023, the official verdict was reached. Cordell M. Howes was charged with first-degree murder and arson. The complete case was forwarded to the court, clearing the way for further proceedings. In the Milwaukee community, especially those who knew Cashay, everyone followed the case's every move. For them, the gradual unraveling of justice was not only a relief to an individual, but also a testament to the power of investigative science and the perseverance of law enforcement. In June 2024, the Milwaukee County Courthouse opened the trial of Cordell M. Howes, a case that had been making headlines for more than a year. Dozens of reporters and residents lined up outside the courthouse early in the morning. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Everyone was waiting for the final answer to the fate of the 33-year-old man accused of taking the life of Cashay Henderson and setting it on fire to cover up the evidence. During days of testimony, prosecutors presented a strong case. From matching fingerprints in the victim's car, footprints in the snow, video footage shot by Cordell himself, to witness testimony of a figure leaving the building in the early morning hours of February 26, 2023.
Proves beyond a reasonable doubt that on February 26 of 2023, in the early morning hours, the defendant got a ride to Ms. Henderson's residence, shot her twice in the head, set her body on fire, took a video of her body before he did so, and then stole her property.
Some of it you might find disgusting, some of it you might find troubling. So again, focus on the direct portions of the questions. What has the state proven? Have they proven what they claim to the level beyond a reasonable doubt? Not guesswork, not speculation. What have they proven at the end?
Each detail was pieced together, forming an undeniable chain of evidence. In addition, forensic experts also confirmed that Cashay's death occurred before the apartment caught fire, clear evidence that the fire was only a cover-up. The defense tried to turn the situation around, emphasizing that Cordell had been under a lot of mental pressure and difficult circumstances. They pointed to the inconsistencies in the witness testimony and suggested that the video could be taken out of context. However, given the scientific data and objective assessments, that argument was not enough to convince the jury. On the final day of the trial, as prosecutors played the video found on Cordell's phone, many in the audience burst into tears. Cashay's friends and family hugged each other, their faces a mixture of grief and hope for justice. Not only the LGBTQ+ community in Milwaukee, but also ordinary people who knew Cashay were present, using their presence as a way to remember her and demand justice for her. As their deliberations ended, the jury retired to deliberate. Less than an hour later, they returned with a resounding verdict. Cordell Howes was guilty of first-degree murder, arson, and illegal possession of a weapon while a convicted felon. The verdict brought a deafening silence, then an explosion of sobs and sighs of relief. On November 25, 2024, the court officially announced the verdict. Cordell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional years for related crimes. The judge emphasized that the sentence was intended to send a clear message that justice will not tolerate cruel and calculated acts. The verdict closes a haunting chapter in Milwaukee's history, but the echoes linger. Cashay's friends brought her portrait to the courtroom, their eyes red but proud that the truth had finally been proven. For the LGBTQ+ community, this is not just justice for an individual, but also recognition of their value and presence in society. And so, nearly 2 years after that cold morning when smoke and flames billowed from the small apartment on a quiet street, justice has officially called for Cashay Henderson. But for those who loved and accompanied her, the loss remains raw, a void that no verdict can fill. The death of Cashay Henderson, which occurred on the morning of February 26, 2023, not only ended the life of an energetic 31-year-old woman, but also left an irreplaceable void in the hearts of those who knew her. Friends remember Cashay as someone who always knew how to make people laugh, an individual who lived authentically and was unabashedly supportive of the LGBTQ+ community around her. But her passing has once again exposed a harsh reality. Transgender women of color remain among the most vulnerable, often facing the dangers of social prejudice and a lack of safety in everyday life. The June 2024 trial and November 25, 2024 life sentence affirmed justice in the eyes of the law, but that is not enough to erase the pain or prevent similar tragedies in the future. Cashay's case serves as a reminder that justice does not stop at court decisions, but must also be nurtured by change from within the community, where people are recognized and appreciated for their true worth. The question that still echoes after the verdict is, when will society ensure that no one has to sacrifice their safety just to be true to themselves? It is a challenge for everyone to reflect and act, so that losses like that of Cashay Henderson will not be repeated.